Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that smells faintly of lawn fertilizer, cigarette smoke, and a casserole that's been in the oven a little too long. We're diving into the world of 1970s American suburbia, not the nostalgic soft focus version from the movies. Not the golden-hued neighborhood where everyone waves from the porch and life is one long barbecue. I mean the real thing. The burnt orange appliances, the avocado green carpeting, the station wagon with the fake wood paneling that your dad treated like a second child. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want to start by giving a truly sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and I want you to know that suggestions like yours are quite literally why this channel exists. Every time someone takes a moment to leave an idea in the comments, it shapes what we do here and helps this little community grow into something real. It genuinely means the world to me. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always either 11:30 on a Tuesday or 2 in the morning on a Friday, and I love both equally. The channel is also now live on Spotify, by the way. Link is in the description if you want to take tonight's journey on the go. Now dim those lights, throw on a fan for that soft white noise, pull your blanket up and get comfortable. Seriously, feet in, don't leave them dangling. Not because of imaginary monsters. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live in a suburb in the 1970s? Did people really let their kids roam the neighborhood until the streetlights came on, with zero supervision and zero sunscreen? Did every house genuinely smell like cigarettes and pot roast at the same time? What was it like to have one telephone, mounted to the kitchen wall with a cord so short you had to stand completely still while arguing with your mother? Could you actually survive a summer with no air conditioning, 3 channels on the television, and a father who considered going for a drive a legitimate form of entertainment? Did anyone enjoy Tang, or were they just pretending? And what exactly was in that jello mold your neighbour brought to every single potluck? Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American suburbs. The year is 1973. You have shag carpeting between your toes, a faint headache from your parents' cocktail party last night, and there is absolutely nothing on television except a test pattern and a man in a plaid blazer talking about the weather. Welcome home. You live in a ranch-style house, which sounds impressive, until you realise it just means everything is on one floor, and the ceiling is low enough that your uncle, who is 6 feet tall, has to duck through the hallway bathroom door. The outside is clad in either brick veneer or aluminum siding in a shade of beige that doesn't have a name because no one wanted to claim it. There's a 2-car garage, 1 car, 1 wall of accumulated stuff, and a front lawn your father mows with the kind of focused religious devotion typically reserved for cathedrals. Inside, the living room is a museum of the era. A plaid sofa that scratches the backs of your knees, a console television the size of a small refrigerator, wall-to-wall carpeting in a burnt orange hue that hides stains because it is itself the colour of a stain, and a single decorative lamp shaped like an owl, whose eyes glow amber in the dark and have been giving the children nightmares since 1971. The hallway is narrow, not uncomfortably narrow, just narrow enough that 2 people passing in opposite directions have to perform a small sideways shuffle, a brief dance of cohabitation that occurs approximately 40 times a day, and that no one ever mentions because it has simply become part of moving through the house. The walls of the hallway are panelled in a dark wood-look laminate that absorbs light like a personal ambition, lined with school photos in a row that tells the story of every haircut you've ever survived. At the end of the hallway, the bathroom. We will return to the bathroom. The kitchen is harvest gold, the refrigerator is harvest gold, the stove is harvest gold, the backsplash tile is a slightly different shade of harvest gold, which the designer of 1969 considered a sophisticated contrast, and which you now understand as the colour theory of a person who had made a commitment and was seeing it through. The countertops are a laminate printed to suggest marble. though the suggestion is tentative at best, the way a crayon drawing suggests a horse. There is a spice rack on the wall with small labelled jars containing dried herbs that have not been actively spiced since approximately the previous administration. The bedrooms are small and specific. Your parents' room has a queen-sized bed with a headboard that incorporates built-in nightstands and reading lamps in a design that seemed futuristic in 1970 and now simply seems like a decision. Your room has a twin bed, a dresser with a mirror, and shag carpet, deep and forgiving. The kind you can lose a pencil in and find it 3 months later when you're looking for something else. Your sibling's room is across the hall and shares a wall thin enough that every conversation, argument, and midnight snack is a shared experience, whether anyone consented to that arrangement or not. The basement, if you have one, is the house's unconscious, a room of unfinished walls, exposed pipes, a water heater that makes periodic noises like a man clearing his throat, a chest freezer containing things wrapped in white paper and labelled in marker with dates from years you can barely remember, a ping-pong table under a sheet, and the vague but persistent sense that a project was started here and set aside and will someday be returned to. It will not be returned to. And over all of it, the carpet, the kitchen, the panelled hallway, the basement's particular atmosphere, there is a smell. Not a bad smell, not a good smell, simply the smell of the house, of your specific house, which you cannot detect yourself because you live inside it, but which is immediately identifiable to every single person who walks through the front door, and which you will recognize instantly, decades later, if you ever smell it again. It is the smell of a family living its life in a specific decade, in a specific place, and it is, in its way, the most real thing about the whole arrangement. The alarm clock on the nightstand is a squat little analog thing with 2 bells on top that goes off like a tiny fire drill inside your skull. There's no snooze button, or there is a snooze button, and it buys you exactly 9 minutes, which is not enough time to do anything except realise how badly you needed more than 9 minutes. You lie there for a moment in your bedroom, which is papered in a pattern of tiny brown and orange geometric shapes that, if you stare at them too long, begin to look like a hallucination. The ceiling is textured in what designers of the era called popcorn finish, which is exactly what it looks and feels like. Someone sprayed the ceiling with a mixture of plaster and regret. Now comes the challenge. There is 1 bathroom. 1. For a family of 4. And your father has already been in there for 11 minutes. This is the central logistical crisis of mourning in the 1970s suburban home. There is no second bathroom, or there is a half bathroom downstairs, but the half bathroom has a sink and a toilet and no shower and no mirror of useful size, and is therefore not a solution. It is a consolation prize. The real bathroom, the only real bathroom, is occupied. It will continue to be occupied for a duration that bears no relationship to any estimate previously offered. You stand in the hallway in your pyjamas, which are a synthetic blend that has generated enough static electricity overnight to power a small appliance. You wait. Everyone is waiting. This is simply how the morning begins. When your turn arrives, the bathroom is warm with steam and the particular atmosphere of someone else's morning routine, which is intimate in a way that family life makes normal, and which you think about not at all because there is no time. The bathroom itself is small and specific. Black and white tile on the floor, possibly a tile border in some accent colour that seemed like a good idea at the time of installation. A mirrored medicine cabinet above the sink whose shelves contain an archaeology of the family's health and hygiene going back several years. There is a half-used tube of something, a prescription bottle with a label you've never read, a small container of Brill cream that belongs to your father and that he has been using since before you were born and will continue to use until the end of time. You brush your teeth with a toothbrush that is either yours or your siblings'. The distinction has blurred, and a toothpaste in a flavour that tastes like mint's enthusiastic but less sophisticated cousin. The shower is brief because the water heater is not infinite, and because there are other people. Hot water in a household of 4 in the 1970s is a finite resource managed under informal but deeply felt rationing protocols. Going first means hot water and being late for the bus. Going last means cold water and arriving on time. It is a negotiation conducted every morning in real time and never quite resolved. You get out, dry off with a towel that has been washed so many times it has achieved a specific texture, not quite soft, not quite rough, simply present, and look at yourself in the mirror, which is still slightly fogged at, the edges from the shower. You locate your clothes. This requires memory or luck, depending on whether you laid them out the night before, which you did not. You pull on jeans, stiff, dark denim with a wide leg that is the fashion of the era, and which you will spend the next 40 years believing looked great on you, and a shirt in some configuration of stripes or plaid or both simultaneously. You are dressed. You are technically ready. You go downstairs where the coffee's already made and your mother is already doing 3 things at once, and the day, with all of its specific 1970s demands, is already underway. Breakfast in the 1970s suburb is less of a meal and more of a philosophy. Specifically, the philosophy that if scientists made it, it's probably better for you than whatever nature had in mind. The kitchen, which you'll notice is decorated entirely in shades of avocado green and harvest gold, contains a refrigerator, a stove, a percolator that has been gurgling since 5:45 in the morning, and a pantry so full of boxed, canned and dehydrated products that it looks like someone is preparing for a very beige apocalypse. Your mother sets a box of cereal on the table. Not just any cereal, a cereal whose mascot is a cartoon animal, whose first 3 ingredients are various configurations of sugar, and whose back panel promises a free prize at the bottom of the box. You will eat the entire box over the next 3 days looking for that prize. It will be a temporary tattoo of a race car. It will not be worth it. There is also Tang. Tang is powdered orange drink mix, not orange juice, not a product of any orange that has ever existed in nature, but a powder that, when mixed with water, produces a liquid of vivid orange colour and a flavour that is adjacent to orange the way a painting of a fire is adjacent to warmth. Tang was originally developed for use in the space program, and this is a fact that 1970s marketing leaned into with full commitment. The implication was that if astronauts drank it, you should too, which is the same logic that would suggest you should also eat dehydrated food packets and urinate into a tube. Your mother mixes it in a plastic pitcher. You drink it without complaint because you have never known anything different. The toaster is working. The toaster is always working. Pop-Tarts go in, and 2 minutes later something emerges that is technically food. A rectangle of pastry with a filling of fruit-flavoured substance, and a frosting layer on top that heats unevenly, cool at the edges and scalding at the centre, hot enough to remove the roof of your mouth in a way that no printed warning has ever managed to adequately convey. You eat it anyway, immediately, because patience is not available at this hour. Your father drinks his coffee, black, from a ceramic mug with a handle that is just slightly too small for a comfortable adult grip, and reads the newspaper. The newspaper arrives every morning, tossed from a moving car onto the driveway at an angle that deposits it either in the bushes or in a shallow puddle with statistical regularity. He has retrieved it, dried it slightly on his trouser leg, and is now working through it with the systematic focus of a man processing information in the only media format he trusts. If something in it is interesting, he will read a portion aloud to your mother, who will respond without looking up from whatever she's doing, and this exchange will constitute the news briefing for the household. Eggs appear on some mornings, scrambled in a pan with butter, not olive oil, never olive oil, Olive oil is not something your mother keeps in this kitchen in 1973 because olive oil is for Italian restaurants and people who have travelled. Bacon appears on weekends, filling the kitchen with a smell so aggressively pleasant that it constitutes a form of alarm clock for anyone still asleep. Pancakes appear when someone has the time and the will made from a mix in a box poured onto a cast iron griddle that has been in the family longer than some of the children. Nobody discusses nutrition. The word nutrition, as a practical consideration in daily food choice, is not yet part of the morning conversation. Calories are not counted, at least not at this table, at this hour. You eat what is put in front of you, or you eat what you can find, or you leave without eating and spend the hours until lunch operating on tang and optimism. Either way, the day has begun, and the kitchen, warm and loud and gold, has done its job. No piece of machinery defined 1970s suburban life quite like the family station wagon, and specifically no design choice defined the station wagon quite like the fake wood grain panelling along the sides. A strip of vinyl printed to look like wood that fooled absolutely no one, but which every family patriarch defended as if it were genuine mahogany. The wagon was enormous. Not big, enormous. Long enough that your father had to execute a 3-point turn just to get out of the driveway, wide enough that it occupied a lane and a half on the highway, and built entirely from steel so heavy that a minor fender bender created a sound like two battleships colliding. It had a bench seat in the front, a bench seat in the middle, and, if you were very lucky or very unlucky, depending on your perspective, a rear-facing third row in the back where two children could sit staring out the back window at the cars behind you for entire cross-country road trips. The interior was a specific ecosystem. The carpet, and yes, there was carpet in the cargo area, had absorbed years of family life in a way that defied ordinary cleaning. There were French fries in the seat crevices from a drive-through visit in 1971. There was a dried ring on the rear carpet where a thermos had leaked on a family vacation that no one would confirm the year of. There was a smell, part vinyl, part gasoline, part the particular combination of every person who had ever been in this vehicle, and under all of it somehow, the ghost of a fast food bag that had been removed from the car but whose legacy endured. The front bench seat meant your mother sat in the middle, which was either democratic or impractical depending on your perspective, and your father drove with one arm occasionally extended across the top of the seat, in a posture of automotive sovereignty that communicated wordlessly that this car, this road, this journey were all under his specific management. There were no seatbelt laws with teeth, no airbags, no backup cameras, no collision sensors. There was a steering wheel, a dashboard with analog gauges, an AM radio, and the basic understanding that you were in a steel box moving at highway speed, and the main safety feature was everyone paying attention, which was not guaranteed. The car had no air conditioning, or the air conditioning was broken, which was a distinction without a meaningful difference in August. You drove with the windows down, all 4 windows down, creating a wind tunnel that made conversation impossible above a certain speed, and that deposited highway air directly onto every surface, including your mother's carefully arranged hair, about which your father said nothing because he had learned which observations were useful and which ones were not. You sat in the back, arm out the window, watching the suburb give way to highway, give way to wherever you were going, and the hot, rushing air was simply the air of travel, the texture of being somewhere else. The station wagon broke down with a regularity that seemed almost intentional. Not catastrophically, not at the side of the road in the rain, though that too, at least once, with everyone standing on the shoulder while your father looked at the engine with the expression of a man who knows he is looking at a problem but not the solution to the problem. More often it was a slow decline, a squeal that appeared and was noted and was not addressed until it became something else, a shimmy at highway speed that everyone agreed to call character. Maintenance happened on the driveway on Saturday afternoons. Your father underneath the car on a piece of cardboard, handing requests for tools upward. You handed tools. This was participation. The station wagon carried everything. Groceries, children, camping gear, Christmas trees strapped to the roof with bungee cords and a specific knot your father believed in deeply. Furniture from relatives, the occasional neighbour who needed a ride. It was a vehicle of infinite practical utility and zero glamour, and it was beloved in the way that things you depend on entirely and never compliment tend to be beloved. It was simply there in the driveway, waiting. The family's mobility. The era's most honest automotive statement. We have a lot of things and people to move, and we are moving them in vinyl. Wood grain at the speed limit, with the windows down. The kitchen in a 1970s suburban home was not just where food was made. It was the nerve centre, the command post, the room where everything happened, including arguments, homework, phone calls conducted at a whisper with the cord stretched as far as it would go, and at least 3 conversations simultaneously about 3 completely different things. The countertops were laminate, usually in a pattern involving small flecks of gold or brown, designed specifically to hide crumbs while simultaneously making everything look slightly dirty even when it was clean. The floor was linoleum, sometimes patterned to look like tile, sometimes patterned to look like brick, always patterned to look like something it was not. There was a kitchen table with chrome legs and a vinyl top, surrounded by chairs that made a specific sound when you slid them across the linoleum, a sound your father asked you to stop making approximately 400 times between 1970 and 1978. The refrigerator was a monument, not metaphorically, physically. A large, humming, harvest gold box of mechanical commitment that maintained the household's food supply and also served as the family's notice board, covered in a rotating exhibition of school schedules, doctor's appointment reminders, drawings held up by magnets shaped like fruit, and a grocery list that was perpetually half complete, because someone, and it was always someone, never a specific named person, had used the last of something and not written it down. The interior of the refrigerator was organised according to a system that only your mother fully understood and that collapsed immediately whenever anyone else attempted to put something away. The stove had 4 burners and an oven, and it ran constantly during the productive hours of the day. Breakfast was made on it. Lunch was made on it. Dinner was made on it, beginning in some cases as early as 4 in the afternoon, when the particular smells of the evening meal began to fill the house and announced to everyone within range that something was being managed and that someone was managing it. The something was often a casserole. The 1970s were the golden age of the casserole, a form of cooking that combined protein, starch and vegetable into a single baking dish, in a way that was efficient, warm, and covered in either breadcrumbs or a layer of crushed crackers, or, in the most ambitious preparations, a can of condensed cream of mushroom soup, which served as both sauce and seasoning, and which appeared in so many recipes of the era that it might as well have been a food group. The kitchen was also where the homework was done, at the table in the late afternoon, while your mother moved between the counter and the stove and the refrigerator, in a choreography so practiced it had become invisible. She asked how school was. You said fine. She asked what fine meant. You said good. This exchange occurred every day with the reliability of a scheduled event and was satisfying to neither party, and was continued anyway because it was the shape of the conversation, the form of the checking in, and form, in the 1970s suburb, carried significant weight. The trash compactor, if you had one, and having one was a specific mark of domestic modernity in this era, was under the counter and made a sound when operating that shook the cabinet door and impressed guests in a way that now seems impossible to explain. The dishwasher cycled in the evening and provided a reliable background sound for the hours after dinner. The percolator sat on the counter between uses like a retired athlete, not needed at this moment but available, and the availability was the point. At night, after dinner, after dishes, the kitchen was the last room to go dark. Your mother wiped the counter in a final pass, not because it was dirty but because the gesture completed something, closed the loop on the day's domestic labour, said, "This is done for now, until it needs to be done again tomorrow." The linoleum floor gleamed faintly under the under-cabinet light left on against the dark. The refrigerator hummed. The kitchen rested. And the house, briefly, was quiet. Let's talk about the women who ran these households, because the 1970s suburb did not run itself, and it certainly did not run on the efforts of the man who left at 8 and came home at 6 and considered mowing the lawn on Saturday his primary domestic contribution. The suburban housewife of the early 1970s was operating inside a system that had spent several decades telling her that her highest calling was a clean floor and a hot dinner, while simultaneously, on the television, and in the magazines and in the very air of the era, new voices were beginning to say something different. It was a strange moment of cultural whiplash, Betty Crocker on one side, Betty, Friedan on the other, and in the middle, a woman standing at a harvest gold stove in a house she has cleaned 3 times this week, wondering which version of herself she's supposed to be today. Her day begins before anyone else's and ends after everyone else's, a temporal arrangement that is so standard it is invisible. She is up first. The coffee is on before the alarm clock sounds. She has a mental list, not written down anywhere, that contains approximately 40 items in various states of completion, organised by urgency and dependency. The kind of list that, if you tried to hand it to someone unfamiliar with its logic, would look like chaos, and which is in fact a highly sophisticated project management system operating entirely inside one person's head, unpaid, unacknowledged, and completely essential to the daily survival of everyone in the house. She does the grocery shopping, the scheduling, the correspondence with teachers, the coordination of doctor's appointments, the tracking of whose shoe size has changed and whose hasn't, the management of what is in the freezer, and what needs to be defrosted and when. She knows what every person in the household is supposed to be doing at any given time, on any given day, with a precision that would be remarkable in a professional context and which in this context is simply expected. If she gets it right, and she almost always gets it right, it is invisible. If she gets it wrong, it is notable. The magazine she reads in whatever small window the day provides, a women's magazine on the counter while she eats lunch standing up, which is how she eats lunch, standing at the counter, because sitting down for lunch alone would feel like a decision that required justification. Tell her simultaneously that she should be making her own bread, that she should be fulfilling her own potential, that her floors should be cleaner, that her hair should be different, that there are women who are doing more than she is doing, and that the thing she is doing is not being taken seriously. This is not a comfortable set of messages to receive concurrently, and she receives them concurrently every week. By the middle of the decade, things are shifting, slowly, imperfectly, with considerable friction. Some women in the neighbourhood have gone back to work or started working, or have been working all along in arrangements that are not fully discussed over the fence. The conversations at the school pickup, the coffee clatch on Tuesday morning, the phone call after the kids are in bed. They are different than they were 5 years ago. Something is loosening. Something is being said out loud that was previously only said in the same room as people who already knew you meant it. Your mother, or the woman playing this role in whatever version of the 1970s suburb you're imagining, is not one thing. She's not a martyr, and she's not a saint, and she is not a problem to be solved by a later generation. She is a person living in the middle of a specific historical moment, doing an enormous amount of difficult and skilled work, mostly well, with limited support and limited credit, and getting up the next morning to do it again. That is the actual job. It is, by any reasonable measure, a real one. The 1970s suburb was many things, but it was never anonymous. Your neighbours knew your car, your schedule, your approximate grocery budget, and whether or not you'd had a rough week, based purely on whether your lawn had been mowed. This was the era before privacy fences were truly socially acceptable. You had hedges, you had chain link, but mostly you had a clear line of sight from your kitchen window to the kitchen window of the family next door, and both parties had unspoken but firm opinions about what they saw. The neighbourhood functioned on a kind of informal surveillance that would make a modern data analyst envious. Mrs. Peterson, 3 houses down, knew when you got home, who visited, and how long they stayed. She didn't consider this nosiness. She considered it community. She was not entirely wrong, and she was also absolutely keeping notes. The neighbourhood had its own social geography, invisible to outsiders, perfectly legible to everyone inside it. There was a block that was considered slightly nicer than your block, in a way that no one could precisely define but everyone acknowledged. There was a cul-de-sac at the end of the street that had developed its own microculture, a slightly tighter set of relationships and a barbecue rotation that functioned like a small sovereign state. There was the family on the corner whose children everyone's parents used as a behavioural reference point, a kind of gold standard of childhood performance that was mentioned when you fell short and never acknowledged when you exceeded it. Disputes in the neighbourhood were managed through a system of escalating indirection. First, you did not say anything. Second, you mentioned it to someone else in a tone suggesting you were not really complaining, just noting. Third, you mentioned it slightly more directly to a mutual party. Fourth, you said something, briefly, in a way that allowed the other party to respond without either of you having to acknowledge that this was a conflict rather than a casual conversation about a matter of shared interest. The dispute was either resolved or became a permanent feature of the relationship, a low-grade ambient tension that lasted years and was referenced at family dinners with a tone suggesting ancient grievance and an anecdote involving a property line or a dog or both. The Neighbourhood Watch was not yet an official programme with signs and meetings. It was simply the fact that everyone was watching. Children moved through the neighbourhood under a distributed supervision system, not your parents' eyes specifically, but any adult's eyes. The neighbour gardening, the retiree on the porch, the woman who seemed to be at her window whenever anything occurred. If you were doing something inadvisable, someone would know. If someone knew, your parents would know. The chain of information was short and reliable, which was either reassuring or oppressive depending on whether you were the parent or the child. Block parties happened, at least once a summer, organised by someone who had the organisational energy in the folding tables. The street was closed with orange cones borrowed from the town public works department through a process no one could fully explain. People brought food, which meant the block party table was a sociological survey of the neighbourhood's cooking habits, a potato salad, a green bean casserole, a sheet cake with frosting in a specific shade of white, several things in slow cookers, and at least one dish whose contents were not immediately identifiable and which was nonetheless consumed. Children ran in a large unsupervised group. Adults stood in small supervised groups. Someone brought a radio. Someone else brought a better radio. The neighbourhood was not paradise. It had its loneliness, its friction, its quiet unhappinesses lived out behind matching beige facades. But it also had, in the most literal and unglamorous sense, people who knew your name and would notice if something went wrong. That is not a small thing. In the 1970s suburb, you were embedded in a web of proximity and familiarity and mild mutual obligation that you could find suffocating or comforting or both, sometimes on the same Tuesday. Either way, you were not alone. You were, whether you wanted to be or not, part of something. And something, it turns out, is quite a lot. There is perhaps no object that captures the particular texture of 1970s suburban life quite like the kitchen wall telephone, that heavy, boxy, rotary or push-button device bolted to the wall beside the refrigerator, with a coiled cord that in theory extended 4 feet and in practice, through years of stretching and pacing, now extended approximately 9, long enough to reach the pantry if you really committed to it. The telephone was a shared resource in the same way that oxygen was a shared resource, technically available to everyone in the household but subject to competition, negotiation, and occasional hostility. If your mother was on the phone, you waited. If your father was on the phone, you waited quietly. If your older sister was on the phone, you waited, knocked, were told to go away, knocked again, were told again, and eventually gave up and went outside, which was probably the intended outcome. Calling someone required knowing their number, not having their number in your contacts, not pulling it up from a search, knowing it in your memory as a string of digits, the way you knew your own address or the multiplication tables. Phone numbers were written in an address book, an actual book, small, alphabetized, kept in a drawer or on a shelf near the phone, filled with handwriting in various pens reflecting years of entries and crossings out and re-entries. If you lost the address book, you had lost the phone numbers, and the phone numbers were not backed up anywhere. They were simply gone, and you would have to ask people for them again, which was a mild social ordeal. Dialing was physical. On a rotary phone, you put your finger in the hole corresponding to the digit and pulled the dial clockwise to the stop and released it. For each digit, a 7-digit phone number required 7 separate dial pulls. If you misdialed the 6th digit, you hung up and started again. This was the procedure. Nobody found it remarkable. It was simply how calling worked, the same way walking to a destination rather than driving was simply how getting somewhere worked before you had the car. Not a hardship, just the texture of the thing. The conversations had no privacy. 0. The phone was in the kitchen. The kitchen was the centre of the house. There was nowhere to go. The cord reached the pantry as established. The pantry was adjacent to the kitchen. You could lower your voice, but lowering your voice in a house with thin walls and alert family members produced the effect of a stage whisper. Technically quieter, actually more conspicuous. Your mother heard. She was always there, not eavesdropping technically, because eavesdropping implies concealment, and she was openly present in her own kitchen, simply also there while you were on the phone, an arrangement everyone accepted as normal, and that required you to develop a private language of implication and omission in your conversations that served, in retrospect, as excellent training for adulthood. Teenagers in the 1970s suburb had a specific and consuming relationship with the telephone that their parents regarded with varying degrees of tolerance and alarm. An hour on the phone with a friend you had just spent the entire school day with was standard. The phone was the continuation of the social world into the home, the extension of the day after the day officially ended. It was connection, which was urgent, which felt necessary, which it was. Your parents' position on this, that you could not possibly have anything left to say to a person you'd seen 3 hours ago, was both technically defensible and entirely missing the point. The bill came once a month, and your father looked at it with an expression calibrated precisely between resignation and mild accusation. Long-distance calls to relatives in other states, to family in different area codes were noted. Long-distance cost money, real noticeable money, and was used accordingly. For significant news, for scheduled Sunday calls that lasted no longer than approximately 8 minutes, for the kind of communication that justified the expense. You did not call long-distance casually. Casual was for local, and local was right here, in the kitchen, on the wall, available, shared, and the sole, telephone in the house, 1 cord, no privacy, maximum drama. It was enough. Children in the 1970s suburb lived a life that, by the standards of any subsequent decade, would be classified somewhere between impressively free range and mildly dangerous. You left the house in the morning, you came back when the streetlights came on. What happened in between was entirely your business, and no one was tracking it on a phone because there were no phones in your pocket. There was one phone and it was on the kitchen wall and it was not coming with you. You roamed. This is the only word for it. You roamed the neighbourhood, the empty lots, the drainage ditch behind the elementary school that everyone called the creek, even though it was technically a drainage ditch, the woods behind the subdivision that the developers had not gotten to yet, the neighbour's yard, the other neighbour's yard, the backyard of the family that had a trampoline and had made it very clear it was not for general use but had also left it unattended, so the rules were few and loosely enforced by proximity rather than surveillance. Don't go past the corner. Don't go past the school. Don't go past the main road, which meant the main road was the horizon of your world, beyond which lay everything unknown and therefore magnetic. These were the rules. You understood them. You also understood that nobody was checking, and that the corner, the school, and the main road were all in fact regularly visited during the hours of your unsupervised existence. This was not considered a crisis by anyone. It was considered childhood. Bikes were the primary technology of freedom. Not helmeted, not knee-padded, not fitted with mirrors or lights or reflective gear. Just bikes, ridden at whatever speed the terrain allowed, down hills that were steeper than sensible, around corners that required more lean than your centre of gravity technically endorsed, occasionally with a passenger on the handlebars in an arrangement that physics regarded as experimental. Falling was a regular feature of bike riding, not a failure of bike riding. You fell, you assessed the situation, you got back on. If the injury was bad enough to require parental involvement, you went home. If it wasn't, you didn't. This triage system was operated entirely by the injured party and had a very high threshold. Summer was the high season of unsupervised existence. School was out. The days were long. The neighbourhood filled with children the way a bathtub fills with water, gradually from all directions, until there was simply a collective of kids whose membership was loose and whose activities were self-generated, shifting from one thing to another based on who had an idea and how many people were willing to try it. Someone found a rope in a garage. A rope, in the hands of a group of children in a suburb with several trees in it, generates a project. The project was never fully safe. It was usually completed anyway, and the completion was satisfying in a way that directed, supervised, adult-organised activity rarely managed to be. Boredom was allowed. Boredom was, in retrospect, the engine of most of what was interesting about childhood in this era. If you were bored, there was no screen to pick up. There was no one to arrange an activity for you. There was only the particular pressure of an empty afternoon and the resources of the neighbourhood and your own imagination, which turned out to be a productive combination. You built things, terrible things, unstable things, things that didn't work the first time and sometimes worked the third time. You invented games whose rules shifted mid-play. You performed experiments with the garden hose. You spent 40 minutes trying to catch a specific frog for no reason anyone could later explain, and that frog was the most important thing in the world for that 40 minutes. When the streetlights came on, you came home. This was the signal, municipal and impersonal, asking nothing except your return. You came in the back door, the screen door banging behind you with a sound that was the specific sound of summer days ending, kicked off your shoes in a way your mother would note and ask you to correct, and arrived at the dinner table with dirty hands and a successful day of nothing in particular, which was, quietly, everything. Every suburban house of the 1970s had a backyard, and every backyard contained roughly the same inventory regardless of which cul-de-sac or dead-end street you lived on. A rectangle of lawn in varying states of health, a concrete patio poured directly onto the earth, with no drainage consideration whatsoever, a charcoal grill that had been out there so long it had developed its own patina, a garden hose that was always slightly kinked, a rusted lawn chair with webbed plastic straps in green or orange, and, depending on the family's ambitions, either a vegetable garden or the ghost of a vegetable garden, a small plot of turned earth where someone had planted tomatoes in May with great enthusiasm and then, by late July, had lost interest. The lawn was your father's responsibility, and his relationship with it was personal in a way that resisted analysis. He mowed it on a schedule with the precision of someone who had decided that this was within his control and was going to exercise that control fully. He mowed in straight lines. He edged. He treated the bare patch by the fence with something from a bag and checked on it repeatedly over the following weeks with an investment of emotional attention that was, if you measured it against the actual stakes, objectively disproportionate and entirely understandable. The lawn was the one thing he could improve incrementally, visibly, with direct results. In a decade of inflation and gas lines and national news that offered limited opportunity for personal agency, the lawn was manageable. The lawn yielded to effort. The lawn responded. The grill was lit on weekends, on holidays, and on any warm evening when the idea occurred to someone. Charcoal grilling in the 1970s was not a lifestyle or a philosophy or an identity. It was cooking dinner outside, using a chimney starter or lighter fluid, in amounts that suggested a confidence in fire management that the results sometimes contradicted. Your father stood at the grill with a long-handled spatula and a pair of tongs that were slightly too short for comfortable use, and turned things according to an internal timer calibrated by experience rather than a thermometer. The results were sometimes perfect and sometimes cremated, and were in either case presented with the same authority, because the person who makes the fire has, in the outdoor cooking context, a certain immunity from detailed critique. The patio was concrete and cracked at the edges, where the ground had shifted underneath it over years of freeze and thaw. There was a picnic table on it, or a collection of mismatched lawn furniture that had been acquired over time rather than selected as a set, including at minimum one chair whose webbing had partially given way, and which held adults with a slight diagonal sag that everyone had adapted to without comment. In the evenings, adults sat out here after dinner when the air cooled slightly with drinks, while the children continued to exist somewhere in the yard. The conversation was the conversation of neighbours and married people, neighbourhood news, work news, the comfortable circling back to familiar topics that constitutes a large percentage of adult speech, and that children find baffling and adults find, in retrospect, the texture of a stable life. The garden hose provided in summer the primary water entertainment. Sprinklers were run in the afternoon and children ran through them, and this was sufficient. This was genuinely sufficient as a recreational water feature, and everyone was fine. There was no inflatable splash. Pad, no water slide system ordered from a catalogue. There was a metal sprinkler on a spike that spun and threw water in a rotating pattern and got you adequately wet if you committed to the approach angle. The hose itself, unchained from the sprinkler, was a weapon of enormous versatility and was used accordingly. The backyard was, in the end, the part of the property where the performance of suburban life relaxed slightly. The front yard was public, maintained for the street, for the neighbours, for the general record of the household standing. The backyard was for living in. The lawn chairs sagged. The grill had rust. The tomato plants were probably not going to make it. Nobody was watching, and the particular freedom of a space where nobody was watching was, in the 1970s suburb, worth more than any landscaping improvement your father was already planning for next spring. There is a specific moment in the daily life of the 1970s suburb that functions almost like a liturgical event the moment the family car pulled into the driveway at or around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the father of the household came through the front door. He had been at work, in an office, doing things that were rarely explained to the children in any detail beyond he works very hard, and that's why we have nice things. What you understood was this. Something shifted when he walked in. Your mother had been managing the entire household since roughly 6:45 in the morning, and now the person whose name was on the mortgage had arrived, loosened his tie, accepted a drink that your mother had already prepared because she had learnt his schedule the way a navigator learns tidal patterns, and sat in the chair. The chair. Not a chair, the chair. The chair was a recliner usually, or a specific armchair positioned at the optimum angle to the television, and it was his in the same wordless, absolute way that the garage was his and the grill was his, not because anyone had said so, but because some agreements in the 1970s suburb were conducted entirely through the grammar of furniture placement and uncontested repetition. Nobody sat in the chair. Not the children. Not guests, unless directed there. Not your mother, who'd been on her feet since before he left and could have used a chair arguably more than anyone, but who did not sit in the chair because the chair was his, and this was simply known. He came in through the front door or the garage door, depending on the family. He set down his briefcase, and he had a briefcase, a rectangular leather or faux leather case with metal clasps that snapped, with a finality suggesting the workday was closed, filed, complete, in a specific spot near the door or in the kitchen, where it sat until morning like a sleeping animal. He loosened his tie, which was wide by any subsequent decade's standards, patterned in either a geometric print or a stripe in colours that were enthusiastic. About being colours, he may have removed his jacket and hung it on the back of a chair in the way that drives certain people absolutely insane, and which was not discussed. Then came the decompression period. This was a real and recognised interval in the household's daily schedule, somewhere between 15 minutes and half an hour, during which your father was home but not yet fully present, sitting with the newspaper or the early news, drink in hand, transitioning from the person he was at work to the person he was here. Children were sometimes cautioned not to bother him during this interval, with a tone suggesting the caution was for everyone's benefit. You observed this protocol because the alternative was to interrupt a man who had spent 8 hours being professionally functional and who needed a moment, and this seemed reasonable even if you did not fully have the vocabulary for it at the time. After the decompression period, dinner. Dinner was already made, or nearly made, because the timing of the evening meal was calibrated to his arrival, in a way that required your mother to have been managing the kitchen with the precision of an air traffic controller. Things that took an hour were started at 4. Things that took 30 minutes were started at 4:30. The meal appeared on the table at approximately the right time, which was treated as a baseline expectation rather than a remarkable logistical achievement, because in the 1970s suburb, remarkable logistical achievements performed by women in kitchens were the furniture of daily life, and furniture, by definition, is what you don't notice until it's gone. After dinner, he might do something in the garage, or watch television, or fall asleep in the chair with the news on, in a posture so specific it could be replicated from memory by every person in the house. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, home. And home, in the 1970s suburb, was a place with a specific architecture of roles and rhythms and chairs, and everyone in it knew exactly where they fit, and that knowing was its own kind of order, its own kind of comfort, however imperfect, however ready to be renegotiated by the decade that came next, long before the concept of the man cave entered the cultural vocabulary. The garage served this function in the 1970s suburb with quiet, unpretentious efficiency. It was the one room in the house that was definitionally his, not by law or by any stated agreement, but by the slow, organic accumulation of stuff that no one else wanted to touch and that he alone could navigate without injury. One half of the garage theoretically was for the car. The other half was for everything else, and everything else was a category that expanded over years to include a workbench with a pegboard wall from which tools hung on outlines drawn in marker so you'd know where each one went, which was a system of meticulous organisation that coexisted peacefully with piles of other tools on the bench itself that had not been returned to their outlines since 1971. The garage smelled like its contents: motor oil, sawdust, fertiliser in a half-used bag, old paint in cans whose lids had been hammered back on with the optimistic belief that the paint inside would remain usable for future touch-ups, which it never was. There was a specific quality of cold in the garage in winter, and a specific quality of heat in summer, uninsulated, untempered, the air of a space that made no pretensions to comfort and asked none of its occupants. If you were in the garage, you were working, or you were watching someone work, or you were retrieving something and leaving. You did not linger in the garage for pleasure. You lingered in the garage because the garage was where things got done, and getting things done required a duration proportional to the thing. The workbench was the altar of the space. It was a solid wooden surface, heavily scarred, marked with rings from cans set down without thought, and paint drips in the colours of previous projects, and occasional gouges from tools that slipped. Above it, the pegboard with the tool outlines, the hammer, the screwdrivers in ascending size, the pliers, the level, the wrench set in a row like a family portrait. It was the most organised wall in the house. This was not ironic. The garage was where the organisational instinct that expressed itself elsewhere as mild suggestions about where the keys should be placed found its fullest, most committed expression. Every tool had a place. The place was marked. The system was maintained by one person with the conviction of someone who had decided that this at least would be under control. Projects lived in the garage in various states of completion. A chair with a loose leg, waiting to be reglued. Storm windows leaning against the wall, waiting to be rehung. A small engine from something, a lawnmower, a snowblower, a go-kart, that was going to be built for the children, eventually disassembled on a piece of newspaper on the workbench, waiting for the part that had been ordered from a catalogue 3 weeks ago, and which had not yet arrived. These projects were not abandoned. That is an important distinction. They were deferred, pending parts, pending time, pending the particular alignment of availability and motivation that projects in garages require, and that arrives on a schedule entirely its own. The children were allowed in the garage under supervision, which meant with parental presence and without touching most things. Watching was permitted. Handing tools over when asked was an honour. You handed the wrench. You held the flashlight at the angle you were directed to hold it, which was never quite the right angle according to subsequent feedback, but you held it. This was how things were learned, not in formal instruction, but in proximity, in repetition, in the slow absorption of capability through observation and small participation. You learned that things break and things can be fixed. You learned that fixing things takes longer than breaking them. You learned that the word almost is not the same as done, and that done is the point. The garage door opened to the driveway and the street and the neighbourhood, and on weekend afternoons when the door was up and your father was working, it was a kind of open window into domestic life, visible to anyone passing, a quiet advertisement that someone here was engaged in the business of maintenance, of keeping things going, of the patient unglamorous work of a house that works. The neighbours who walked by sometimes stopped. There was a conversation. Advice was given and received. A tool was borrowed. The garage, door open on a Saturday afternoon, was briefly a social space, the most masculine of the neighbourhood's gathering points, organised around the shared vocabulary of things that need fixing and the mutual respect of people who fix them. If you grew up in the 1970s suburb, Saturday morning was not merely a morning, it was an institution, a weekly event with its own protocols, its own schedule, its own particular quality of light coming through the living room curtains, while everyone else in the house was still asleep and you were on the floor 12 inches from the television in your pyjamas, eating cereal directly from the bowl and experiencing something close to pure joy. This required advanced planning. You had to be up, and the remarkable thing is that you were up effortlessly without an alarm at 6:30 or 7 in the morning, despite the fact that on school days getting you out of bed was an operation that required your mother's full diplomatic capabilities. But Saturday was different. Saturday had cartoons, and the window was specific. It started early, and it ended without negotiation, without apology, around noon, when the programming shifted to sports or local public affairs, programming that no child has voluntarily watched since the invention of television. The television had to be turned on and allowed to warm up, because televisions in the 1970s required a warm-up period, a brief interval of gathering resolution during which the picture emerged from a central bright point and expanded outward to fill the screen, a process that took perhaps 30 seconds and that felt, at 6:30 in the morning when the cartoons were starting, like the longest 30 seconds of the week. The channel had to be selected by turning the dial, an actual dial, with click stops for each channel, turned manually, by hand, by you, because you were right there, and the remote control was either broken, missing, or a concept that had not yet arrived in this household. You found the channel, you adjusted the volume, you sat down on the carpet close enough to the screen that your parents would later observe that you were going to ruin your eyes, which was medically contested but earnestly believed. The cartoons were specific to the era in ways that subsequent animation would find instructive. There were characters who could fall off cliffs and be reassembled in the next frame, characters who ran off the edge of things and stayed airborne until they looked down, characters who absorbed catastrophic impacts and remarked on them with an equanimity that suggested a philosophical relationship with physical consequence. The animation was limited, the same 4 frames of walking cycled, the mouth movement approximate, and none of this mattered at all, because the appeal was not technical quality, it was the characters, the voices, the small weekly ritual of being in their company again. You ate the cereal with the focused attention of someone for whom interruption is not acceptable. The cereal was sweet beyond any reasonable nutritional defense, and the milk at the bottom of the bowl, when you reached it, was faintly coloured from the cereal and slightly sweeter than milk should be, and you drank it. Of course you drank it. You held the bowl up and drank the cereal milk because it was Saturday morning, and no one was watching and the cartoons were on, and this was, by every measure available to a 9-year-old, a perfect moment. The window closed at noon. When the programming changed, you felt it. The specific deflation of the end of Saturday morning cartoons, the week's most reliable pleasure, finished until next week. You turned the television off, or left it on to something that was not cartoons, and gradually the house woke up around you. Your parents downstairs, coffee made, the particular sounds of a Saturday settling into a different rhythm. The rest of the day was available in the way that unscheduled time's available, wide, open, requiring you to fill it yourself. But Saturday morning had been perfect. It had been yours, and next Saturday it would be there again, exactly as promised, starting exactly on time, waiting for you on the floor in your pyjamas with your cereal and your 12 inches of carpet between you and everything that mattered. The weekly trip to the supermarket in the 1970s was not the quick 10-minute errand that modern grocery delivery has made grocery shopping feel like a distant memory of. It was an event, a production, something you prepared for, executed with purpose, and returned from slightly exhausted but fundamentally stocked for the week ahead. Your mother had a list, written in ballpoint pen on the back of an envelope or a torn piece of paper bag, organised not by category but by the order in which she moved through the store, because she had been going to the same supermarket for 4 years, and she knew its geography better than she knew the layout of some of her relatives' houses. The supermarket itself was a cathedral of the processed food era, fluorescent lit, faintly humming, stocked floor to ceiling with items that had not existed 20 years ago and whose existence felt to the marketing departments of major food companies like the pinnacle of human progress. The cart had a wheel that pulled slightly to the left, or a wheel that wobbled, and this was simply the cart you had, and you steered around it with the practiced adjustment of someone who has learned to compensate for a specific problem rather than seek a better cart. The produce section was first: apples, bananas, iceberg lettuce, tomatoes, whose flavour was secondary to their structural integrity, and a cellophane-wrapped package of carrots. Iceberg lettuce was the lettuce. There was not a conversation happening in this suburb in 1973 about arugula. Arugula was not a presence. Iceberg lettuce was cold and crunchy, and formed the base of every salad at every dinner table on the block, and nobody felt that anything was missing. The canned goods aisle was long and significant. Canned vegetables, canned fruit, canned soup, specifically condensed soup, specifically the red and white labelled kind, specifically the cream of mushroom variety that appeared in an extraordinary percentage of the era's recipes, in the same casually essential way that flour appears in baking. Your mother reached for it without looking, the same way she reached for the coffee and the cereal and the other regulars, the items that were not decided upon each week but simply restocked, part of the infrastructure of the household rather than the subject of weekly deliberation. The freezer section held frozen vegetables in bags, frozen fish sticks, frozen pot pies in individual foil tins, and TV dinners, which were a specific product of the era, a complete meal frozen into a segmented aluminum tray, heated in the oven for the time specified on the box, and eaten from the tray itself on the rare evenings when the normal meal routine did not apply. TV dinners were considered a mild luxury of convenience, a small modern miracle, and tasted roughly as their aluminum packaging suggested they might. Coupon clipping was a real and practiced domestic skill. Your mother clipped coupons from the Sunday circular with small scissors kept in a kitchen drawer for this purpose, and organised them in a small envelope or a folded section of paper, and presented them at the checkout with the focused efficiency of someone who has done the arithmetic and knows exactly what they're saving. This was not embarrassing. This was competent household management, and the checkout clerk processed the coupons with the same efficiency, and the total adjusted accordingly, and the difference was noted with satisfaction. The bags were paper, double-bagged for heavier items, carried to the car in a number of trips determined by how much you had bought and how many people were available to carry, and then carried from the car into the kitchen and unpacked in a specific order that your mother managed with the authority of someone returning inventory to its proper location. The refrigerator received its items, the pantry received its items, the freezer was Tetrised back to functionality, the list was done, the week was stocked. The kitchen was ready to produce another 7 days of meals for the people who lived here and needed feeding, which it would do quietly and without particular recognition, right on schedule. Dinner in the 1970s suburban household was served at a specific time, somewhere between 5:30 and 6:30, depending on the family, and attendance was not optional. You ate together. This was not presented as a charming lifestyle choice or a mindful practice or a thing you read about in a wellness article. It was simply what happened. The table was set. The food was served. You sat down. What was served at that table was its own anthropological study of the era. The 1970s were, culinarily speaking, a complicated time, the moment when processed convenience food had fully colonized the American kitchen, when casseroles reached their philosophical apex, when gelatin was used in ways that future generations would struggle to explain. The casserole was the era's signature dish, and it appeared on the table with the reliable frequency of a scheduled appointment. Green bean casserole, green beans from a can, cream of mushroom soup from a can, topped with French fried onions from a can, was a dish so thoroughly constructed from other dishes that it was almost meta, a food about food. Tuna noodle casserole appeared. Chicken and rice casserole appeared. Things were combined in baking dishes and covered in breadcrumbs or cheese or both, and baked until unified, and there was a comfort in the result that was real, even if the process that produced it was primarily the opening of cans. Nobody was embarrassed about the cans. The cans were the point. The cans were the modern miracle, the victory over the labour that previous generations of women had spent entirely in the kitchen. The can meant dinner in 45 minutes. The can was progress. The Jell-O mould deserves its own consideration because it is the dish of the era most likely to produce, in later generations, a response somewhere between confusion and genuine concern. Gelatin, flavoured and coloured, set in a decorative mould overnight, and then turned out onto a plate as a wobbling, gleaming centrepiece that might contain suspended fruit, suspended vegetables, suspended miniature marshmallows, depending on the ambition and philosophy of its maker. The Jell-O mould could be a salad or a dessert. The line was not clearly drawn. Lime gelatin with cream cheese and crushed pineapple occupied a position on the flavour spectrum that defied simple categorization and appeared at dinner tables and potlucks and holiday gatherings with a frequency suggesting either genuine enthusiasm or a very successful marketing campaign, possibly both. The children ate what was served, in the amounts determined to be appropriate, and the negotiation around. This was the nightly theatre of the family dinner. You didn't like something, you expressed this. Your father indicated that this information was not relevant to whether you ate it. Your mother offered a middle position, eat some of it, you don't have to finish it, just try it. That was tactical de-escalation, and mostly worked because it gave everyone something they could accept. The vegetables were non-negotiable. The vegetable was there, and the vegetable was going to be addressed. It might be peas from a can, slightly soft, with a specific texture that canned peas develop, as if the canning process aspires to make them more philosophical than food. It might be green beans, or corn, or carrots. Whatever it was going to be eaten, and this position was held without variation across thousands of dinners. After dinner, the dishes were cleared. This was a collective activity in households that had decided it would be a collective activity, which meant the children had a role, carrying plates, scraping them over the trash, putting them in the dishwasher in the configuration that your mother would later silently rearrange because there was a right way, and the way the children did it was not it. The table was wiped. The leftovers were covered in foil and placed in the refrigerator, where they would be encountered at lunch tomorrow with the mild surprise of rediscovery, as if a day in the refrigerator had done something new to them. The kitchen returned to itself. Another dinner completed. Another day fed. In theory, the living room was the central social space of the suburban home. The room with the good furniture, the console television, the decorative items arranged on surfaces with deliberate care. In practice, the living room was a room you passed through, a room you sat in when company came, and a room that existed in a state of careful preservation during the intervals between company. The sofa was covered, in many houses, literally covered, in clear, plastic slip covers that your grandmother had installed, and which made a specific sound when you sat on them, and a different specific sound when you stood up, both of which were audible from the kitchen. The carpet was vacuumed. The ashtrays, and there were ashtrays, arranged on side tables and coffee tables with the casual accessibility of a room that fully expected people to smoke in it, because people fully expected to smoke in it, were emptied and wiped. The good furniture was good in the way that things reserved for company tend to be good, maintained, somewhat formal, calibrated to an audience. The sofa was firmer than the sofa in the family room, if there was a family room, because it had been sat on less. The side tables had coasters, actual dedicated coasters, deployed with an intentionality that the kitchen table never received. There was a lamp that cast a warm light in the evening, and that no one turned on during the day because daytime was not a time when the living room was in active use, and turning on a lamp in an unoccupied room felt like a statement that the room's general philosophy discouraged. The console television was the living room's most significant object, a piece of furniture as much as an appliance, set into a wooden cabinet with a finish that matched or nearly matched the end tables, designed to look like furniture first and a television second, as if the television were a guest being hosted by the room rather than the room's primary reason for existing, which it increasingly was. The screen was roughly 19 or 21 inches, measured diagonally, which was considered large. It had a dial for channels and a dial for volume, and a fine-tuning adjustment that required occasional intervention, and was never quite right, and was always being almost right, which was the television's default state. Decorative objects occupied the flat surfaces of the living room with the density of a curated collection and the logic of accumulation. A ceramic figurine. A small decorative plate mounted on the wall. A set of candlesticks that were never lit. A bowl of artificial fruit so convincing it had been touched by guests to confirm its nature. A framed print of a landscape in colours coordinated with the carpet and the sofa and the curtains. A room that had, in its decoration, achieved a specific aesthetic coherence that was the result of real effort, and that would be dismantled entirely during the 1980s without ceremony or regret. Company came on weekends usually, and when they came, the living room activated. Your mother brought out the good napkins. Drinks were served from a bar cart or a credenza that contained bottles whose presence was permanent and whose levels changed slowly. A bottle of scotch, a bottle of something amber, a bottle of something clear, mixers, a small ice bucket that was filled for the occasion. The adults sat and talked. The children were present briefly and then redirected elsewhere, which suited the children, who found adult conversation in the living room a specific kind of quiet tedium that they would not appreciate or recognise for another 30 years. And then the company left, and your mother plumped the sofa cushions back to their proper shape, emptied and wiped the ashtrays again, carried the glasses to the kitchen, and the living room returned to its preserved state, clean, arranged, faintly smelling of cigarettes and the particular perfume of whoever had been sitting in the good chair, ready for next time, quietly waiting as it always was for the people who almost never came. In the 1970 suburb, almost everyone smoked, and almost everyone smoked inside, and this is one of those facts that subsequent generations have encountered, with the wide-eyed disbelief typically reserved for learning that medieval people thought bathing was dangerous. Your parents smoked. Your relatives smoked. The paediatrician's waiting room had ashtrays. The station wagon had a built-in ashtray in the armrest. The airplane on the family vacation had a smoking section, specifically a section located behind you and separated from you by nothing except a row designation, as if smoke had ever respected assigned seating. The smell was simply the smell of the era, the way a particular cologne is the smell of a specific relative. You didn't notice it because you'd never not known it. Your father smoked cigarettes in a specific brand and a specific configuration, filtered or unfiltered, long or regular, that he had arrived at years ago and from which he did not deviate, because his cigarette brand was part of who he was in the same quiet way that his cologne and his car were part of who he was. He lit them with a lighter he kept in his shirt pocket, or with matches from a book that accumulated in the kitchen junk drawer, alongside the take-out menus and the batteries of uncertain charge, and the small screwdriver whose purpose was occasionally remembered. He smoked at the kitchen table with his coffee in the morning. He smoked in the car with the window down 1 inch, which was a concession to the passengers rather than a meaningful ventilation strategy. He smoked after dinner in the chair, which was one of the chair's primary functions. Your mother may also have smoked, more likely inside the house and at the kitchen table, and possibly also in a particular way, and with a particular brand that was advertised toward women in the era's cigarette marketing, with the specific implication that this cigarette was slimmer, lighter, more modern, more consistent with the image of a woman who was current and capable and had made a considered choice, which she had, the same way she had made every other considered choice in the household without significant acknowledgement. The ashtray on the kitchen table was a shared resource, and was emptied regularly and refilled regularly in a cycle as continuous and unremarkable as the coffee, percolating beside it. The smell was everywhere because the smoke was everywhere. It lived in the curtains, in the upholstery, in the carpet, in the clothes in the closet, in your hair when you went to school on Monday morning carrying the weekend on you, in a way that was invisible to you because you lived inside the smell and could not smell it. The walls above the sofa were a shade slightly different from the walls elsewhere. Not dramatically, not noticeably unless you knew what to look for, the slow deposit of years of indoor smoking on a surface that received it without complaint. The paint held the record of the decade the way rings in a tree hold the record of its years. Guests smoked in your house. You smoked at their houses. It was reciprocal, communal, woven into the social fabric of visiting and being visited. You offered someone a cigarette the way you offered them a drink, as an act of hospitality, an inclusion into the comfort of the space. The cigarette case, if you had on, was a small object of genuine elegance in an era that had committed to elegance in its social rituals, even when it was slightly undermining its inhabitants' lung capacity. The understanding that this was medically significant was beginning to arrive in the early part of the decade. The Surgeon General had made the first report in 1964, and the warnings were on the packages, and the information was available. But information and behaviour are not the same thing, and changing the behaviour of an entire culture required more than a warning on a package. It required the full weight of social norm to shift, and social norms shift slowly, on a timeline measured in decades rather than announcements. In the 1970s suburb, the norm had not yet shifted. The ashtrays were still full, the smoke was still in the curtains, and the air of the era tasted faintly of all of it. If the 1970s suburb had a summer sacrament, it was the backyard cookout, a ritual that combined food, social performance, and a particular form of male identity construction that centred on the management of fire. The host stood at the grill, always the host. The grill was his domain, his stage, his opportunity to demonstrate competence in the one form of cooking that the culture had decided was masculine, which meant it was done outside, involved flame, and required a specific set of tools with unnecessarily long handles. The rest of the food, the potato salad, the coleslaw, the baked beans that had been in the oven since noon, the rolls, the condiments, the table settings, the drinks, the arrangement of lawn furniture, the keeping of children from the flower beds, had all been organised by someone else, quietly, inside, where no one was watching. The charcoal situation was a production in itself. Lighter fluid was applied generously, more generously than the instructions suggested because the instructions were conservative and the desired outcome was a fire that communicated confidence. A match was struck. The result was a brief controlled flare that was more impressive than dangerous, and that everyone in the vicinity took a small unconscious step back from before returning to their positions. The coals needed to be grey before the food went on, and the monitoring of this greyness was conducted with the focused attention of a man with nowhere else he needed to be and a strong opinion about charcoal readiness. This took longer than people expected. It always took longer, but nobody moved the food to the grill until the coals were right, because that was the standard, and the standard was held. The guests arrived in a sequence that had its own social meaning. The family that arrived first were close friends, comfortable enough not to require a specific time. The family that arrived exactly on time were considerate and slightly formal. The family that arrived 40 minutes late were either having a difficult afternoon or were simply always like this, and everyone knew which one it was. The children, regardless of family of origin, immediately formed a separate roaming group and relocated to the backyard's perimeter, supervised by no one in particular and all the adults collectively, which amounted to the same thing. The food conversation at a 1970s cookout was specific and recurring. The host's recipe for the potato salad, was it mustard-based or mayonnaise-based? Was there celery? What about the paprika on top? The proprietary spice rub for the chicken, which was either a closely held secret or a recipe the host had been given by someone who was not here, and whose absence meant it could be discussed and attributed with only approximate accuracy. The question of when the corn went on the grill, and whether it should be husked first or wrapped in foil, which was a minor theological dispute conducted with more feeling than the stakes warranted, but which represented something real about the right way to do things, and who knew it. Beer was served from a cooler, a large plastic or metal cooler filled with ice and cans, the cans pulled out cold and opened with a church key, or, if you had a can with a pop top, with the pull tab that you detached entirely and dropped into the open can in the manner of the era, which produced a small hazard that everyone accepted as part of the operational context of beer in 1973. Your father's beer was his specific beer, not because he had explored the options, the craft beer movement was decades away, but because he had chosen a beer, probably in his 20s, and the choice had stuck, the way choices made when you're young tend to stick. It was cold, and it was outside, and it was summer. The beer was fine. The cookout ended when it ended, not at a stated time, not by plan, but by the gradual loosening of the gathering, the children called in for baths, the cooler getting light, the evening air arriving and everyone noticing it at once. The housewife began moving things inside. The host began making movements at the grill that suggested the coals were done with. Guests began collecting their dishes. Whoever brought the potato salad took home the bowl and said their goodbyes in the driveway, which took longer than the inside goodbyes by a factor of approximately 3, because driveway goodbyes are a separate social ritual with their own timeline and their own resistance to conclusion. And then they were gone, and the backyard was quiet, and the grill ticked as it cooled, and it had been a good summer evening, which was enough. Your bedroom was small, smaller than you realised at the time, because children have a remarkable ability to inhabit whatever space they're given and make it feel like the entire world. The floor was covered in shag carpet, which in a child's bedroom was not the burnt orange or harvest gold of the rest of the house, but something slightly wilder, perhaps a deep green, perhaps a rust red, the kind of colour that a manufacturer in 1972 thought children would find exciting, and which was correct. Because shag carpet in a bedroom meant you could sit on the floor, actually sit comfortably on the floor, and the carpet would swallow whatever fell into it, including small Lego pieces that you would rediscover years later with the bottom of your foot in the dark. The walls were either painted in a colour your mother had chosen and that you had been given limited input into, or papered in a pattern whose selection had involved a trip to the hardware store and a deliberation process that produced, ultimately, a wallpaper featuring either cartoon characters, geometric shapes, or a repeating nature motif, trees, birds, or something botanical that was meant to be cheerful and calming simultaneously, and achieved this to varying degrees depending on the hour and your mood. The wallpaper was applied with the understanding that it would be here for a while. Redecorating a child's bedroom was not a regular or casual event. You lived with the wallpaper, and the wallpaper lived with you. And over years it became simply the background of your interior life, the visual texture of sleep and waking and childhood. The furniture was modest and functional. A twin bed with a headboard, a dresser of 4 drawers, a desk or a table surface for homework and projects, a bookshelf if you had accumulated enough to justify one. The The closet was small and shared nothing with the modern idea of a walk-in. It was a standard closet with a single rod and a shelf above it, and a floor that collected things, shoes, board games, things slid under when tidying required speed rather than thoroughness. Your mother knew what was in there. You knew what was in there. The floor of the closet was both the bedroom's overflow zone and its most honest archive. On the shelves and dresser top lived the particular population of objects that constituted childhood in this era and in this place. A Tonka truck whose yellow paint had been partially loved off, a collection of baseball cards in a rubber band that you had sorted and resorted according to several different organizational systems over the years, a model car or airplane assembled from a kit with plastic cement and then painted with the small brushes that came in the kit and finished to varying degrees of accuracy, a paperback book with a cracked spine, a jar of pennies, a small trophy from a sport you had played briefly and without distinction, and on the wall above the bed, a poster of a car or a team or a scene from a movie, applied with tape because pushpins in the wall were more permanent than the current enthusiasm necessarily warranted. The room smelled like crayons, not because crayons were currently in use. The crayons were in a box in the desk drawer, broken down to varying lengths, missing several colours and containing several that nobody voluntarily chose because they were too close to brown. But the smell of wax crayon was in the carpet and the shelves and the air of the room, the way a smell gets into a space when enough of that thing has happened there, accumulated over years of afternoons and rainy days and winter weekends. It was the smell of making things, of project and imagination, of the particular busyness of being a child in a room that was entirely and completely yours. Small, specific, irreplaceable, the whole world for now. The school day in the 1970s suburb began with the school bus, which arrived at a specific time that was earlier than any child should reasonably be expected to be functional, and which waited for no one. The bus was a yellow vehicle of roughly the dimensions of a small aircraft hangar, driven by a person of legendary patience, heated in winter to approximately the temperature of a functioning sauna, and in possession of a specific smell, rubber, metal, the particular atmosphere of 50 children in various states of cleanliness that you could identify blindfolded, and that would resurface in your memory uninvited for the rest of your life. You sat where you always sat. The social geography of the school bus was fixed. Moving from your established seat without a compelling reason was the kind of social transgression that 9-year-olds litigated with the seriousness of international diplomacy. The school building was a specific physical artifact of its era, either a 1950s brick structure with long corridors and high ceilings and windows that opened with a crank, or a newer open-plan building that had been constructed in the early 1970s according to a theory of education that believed walls between classrooms were impediments to learning and that the noise of 30 children doing different activities simultaneously was a stimulating environment rather than an obstacle to concentration. This theory was reconsidered within a decade. The classrooms in the brick building smelled of chalk and floor, wax and the particular staleness of a room occupied by children for 6 hours a day since September. The chalkboard was green. The chalk was white and broke at the worst possible moment with a sound that caused involuntary physical responses in everyone who heard it. The cafeteria served lunch at a time determined by your grade, on a rotating schedule that placed you either in the early lunch at 11:15, which felt too early to eat and produced a hunger emergency by 2 in the afternoon, or the late lunch at 12:45, which felt too late and produced a focus problem by noon. The food was institutional in the truest sense. Square pizza on Fridays, tater tots that were either perfectly golden or slightly translucent depending on the batch, a grey protein of some kind on Wednesday, chocolate milk in small wax cartons that you opened by pulling the triangular flap, and a fruit cup in syrup that was technically fruit in the way that a window is technically a wall. You ate most of it. You traded the things you didn't eat with the people sitting next to you who had different things they didn't eat, which was an economy of mild dissatisfaction that somehow arrived at equilibrium. Gym class was held in a gymnasium with floors so polished they registered your reflection walking across them, and acoustic properties that amplified every squeak of sneakers into something approaching a physical sensation. The gym teacher was a specific type of person, energetic in a way that seemed personal rather than professional, convinced that the obstacle course they had arranged in the centre of the gymnasium represented an opportunity you would thank them for, and in possession of a whistle that was used for purposes of punctuation rather than emergency. The activities of gym class in the 1970s included rope climbing, which required ascending a rope by upper body strength alone to a height that would not be considered appropriate in any contemporary physical education setting, the presidential fitness test, which measured your body's capabilities against a national standard and reported the results to you directly with the tact of a document that had not been written with tact as a primary objective, and square dancing, which appeared once a year without warning and required you to hold hands with people you had strong feelings about and move in a prescribed pattern while someone called instructions at volume. The school day ended and you got back on the bus, which was hotter in the afternoon than in the morning and therefore smelled more specifically of itself. You found your seat. The bus moved through the neighbourhood in the reverse sequence of the morning, depositing children at stops in the order that the route determined. You got off at your stop, walked the distance to your house, and came in the back door, and the school day was done. It had been specific, textured, occasionally tedious, occasionally excellent, and entirely unrepeatable, and tomorrow it would begin again in exactly the same way, which was either reassuring or exhausting depending on where you were in the week and how the day had gone. The family vacation in the 1970s did not involve booking flights on an app or comparing hotel reviews on a website. It involved your father spreading a paper map across the kitchen table several weeks before departure, tracing the route with one finger, estimating drive time with an optimism that would prove catastrophically incorrect, and announcing, "We'll leave by 7. You never left by 7. You left by 9:15 after a series of delays whose specific causes shifted with each retelling, but which always concluded the same way. The family wedged into the station wagon, the rear-facing third-row seat occupied by the children who had either earned it as a privilege or been assigned it as a consequence depending on which version of events you believed, the cooler packed with sandwiches and sodas because stopping for food added time and your father was attempting to make his estimated arrival in a way that had taken on the psychological significance of a personal challenge. The map was the only navigation available to you, and navigating from a paper map while driving required either a passenger willing to read it in real time or a set of directions written out in advance on a legal pad in your father's handwriting. Turn left at the Sunoco, cross the bridge, stay on Route 40 until the second light after the water tower, directions that were specific enough to be useful and general enough to be ambiguous at exactly the moments when ambiguity was most costly. Getting lost was not a failure of technology. It was simply getting lost, and it was addressed by pulling into a gas station and asking someone, which your father did after a period of confident wrong direction driving, that your mother tracked in silence with the expression of a person choosing her battles with long-term strategic intent. The children in the back were bored with a boredom that modern childhood, with its screens and devices and curated entertainment ecosystems, has made structurally impossible. You were in a car. There was nothing to do. The window was there. The passing scenery was there. You pressed your forehead against the glass and watched telephone poles go by, in a rhythm that was either meditative or maddening depending on the hour. Someone started a game, I Spy, the license plate game, the alphabet game using roadside signs, and the game lasted between 15 and 45 minutes before collapsing under the weight of a dispute about whether a partially visible sign counted, or whether your sibling was cheating in a way that was difficult to define but completely obvious to you. "Are we there yet?" was asked. The answer was always a variation of "not yet," "we just left," "stop asking," "we'll be there when we get there," which was technically true and completely unsatisfying. Your father's position on stopping was firm. You stopped for gas, and you stopped once, maybe twice, for facilities, at a rest stop on the highway that smelled of industrial cleaner and had a vending machine offering items in configurations that didn't quite correspond to anything you specifically wanted, but that you requested anyway because you were in a rest stop and the vending machine was there. Your mother produced snacks from the cooler at intervals, calibrated to your need and her patience. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a bag of chips that had been rationed into a smaller bag to take up less space in the cooler, which was the kind of logistical optimization that went entirely unacknowledged. The motel, when you finally arrived, was a single-story building with a parking lot directly in front of the rooms and a small swimming pool of moderate cleanliness that was nonetheless the most exciting thing you had encountered in several hours of highway travel. You swam in it, immediately before unpacking before dinner, which your father permitted because you'd been in the car all day and the pool was right there, and sometimes the right decision is simply obvious. The room had 2 double beds, a television bolted to the dresser, a bathroom with paper-wrapped soap and a plastic ice bucket, and a heating and cooling unit under the window that made a sound all night that you fell asleep to within minutes of lying down. You had arrived. Tomorrow there would be a destination. Tonight there was the pool and the soap and the television, and the particular pleasure of being somewhere that was not home, which was, after 8 hours in the station wagon, more than enough. Television in the 1970s suburb was a negotiation, not between you and a streaming algorithm that had analysed your preferences and constructed a personalised queue, but between you and the physical limitations of a technology that received signals from the air and translated them, imperfectly, into a picture. You had 3 channels, possibly 4 if you counted the public television station, and the quality of what you received depended heavily on the orientation of the antenna on top of the set, which someone had to go and adjust by hand while someone else stood in the living room yelling "left, no back, okay stop," while the picture phased in and out of legibility. The television was on for a substantial portion of the evening. After dinner, after dishes, the family gathered in the living room, not necessarily by enthusiastic choice, but because this was simply what happened, and watched whatever was on. There was no watching something later. There was no rewinding. If you left the room at the wrong moment, you missed it, and missing it was forever. The television schedule was printed in the newspaper in a grid, and your mother sometimes consulted it in the afternoon to see what was on that evening, which was the closest thing available to programming choice. You could not choose what to watch in the sense of selecting from a library of options. You could choose which of 3 things to watch at any given hour, or you could watch nothing, which was also a choice, but one that the living room's gravitational pull made difficult to execute past about 8 o'clock on a weeknight. The schedule was fixed. 8 o'clock was a specific show. 9 o'clock was a different specific show. If you didn't like what was on at 8, you waited for 9, or you went to bed, which your parents occasionally suggested with a timing that corresponded suspiciously to the beginning of something they wanted to watch without commentary from the children. The picture was not always good. The picture was frequently not good. Snow, which in television terms meant static interference, a visual of fine grey and white grain over the image rather than a crisp picture, was a regular feature of the viewing experience, addressed by the antenna adjustment protocol described, above or by the subsidiary technique of someone standing next to the set and holding the rabbit ears at a specific angle that improved the reception, a position that could not be maintained indefinitely, but that was held for the opening minutes of a program while everyone confirmed the improvement was real. If moving the antenna made it worse, you moved it back. If moving it back made it worse, you tried a new position. This process had no guarantee of resolution and was accepted as part of the relationship between the household and its television, a relationship with the texture of a long-term partnership in which one party was sometimes uncooperative for reasons that were never fully explained. The commercials were part of the viewing experience rather than an interruption of it. There was no skipping, there was no fast-forwarding. The commercial break was a pause in the program during which the household redistributed. Briefly, someone went to the kitchen for a drink, someone used the bathroom, someone changed the subject of the conversation that had been suppressed during the program's running time, and then everyone returned for the next segment. The commercials themselves were the advertising culture of the era in concentrated form. Breakfast cereals announced in primary colours by animated characters, cars shown on open roads with their dimensions expressed in statistics that nobody could contextually evaluate, cigarette commercials still appearing in the early part of the decade before the broadcast ban took full effect, and a rotating roster of household product ads aimed with undisguised directness at the woman of the house, who was assumed, correctly in most cases, to be watching. Prime time ended. The news came on at 11, and if your parents were still up, they watched the first segment and then the television went off. The dial turned with a click that also turned off the sound, the screen shrinking to a single bright point in the centre before going dark. The house got quiet. The only thing left was the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and whatever was happening outside, which was nothing, because the suburb at 11 o'clock was deeply, specifically quiet. The quiet of a place whose entire population was on roughly the same schedule, winding down in the same sequence, preparing for the same morning. The television had done its work for the day. Tomorrow it would be there again, on the same channels, at the same times, offering the same negotiation between what was on and what you wanted, resolved, as always, in favour of what was on. Going to the doctor in the 1970s suburb was a reasonably routine event, though the experience bore limited resemblance to what the phrase medical care might conjure for someone accustomed to the 21st century. Your paediatrician had an office in a low-brick building in a small professional plaza between a dental office and an insurance agency. The waiting room had chairs, upholstered in a vinyl that had been wiping down since the Nixon administration, a low table with a selection of magazines that were between 3 and 18 months out of date, and a toy corner containing several items of unclear provenance. You waited. Waiting was a significant component of the experience. The doctor, when he appeared, and it was almost always he, wore a white coat and had the particular manner of someone who'd been trusted with authority for long enough that he had stopped explaining his reasoning unless specifically asked. The examination was brief and confident. He pressed things, tapped things, looked into things with a small light, and arrived at conclusions with the speed of a person who had been doing this for many years and who did not require a second opinion because he was the opinion. The stethoscope was cold. You had been told this would happen, and it still surprised you, because the gap between being told something will be cold and the actual experience of something cold is not closed by information. You breathed in, you breathed out, you said "ah" with your tongue depressed by a flat wooden stick that tasted of nothing, and that you were asked not to bite, which you did not bite, though the instinct was there. The medicine prescribed was specific to the era in ways that seem, from the vantage of subsequent decades, like a field operating with tremendous confidence on the basis of incomplete information. Antibiotics were prescribed freely, and for conditions that would later be understood as viral, and therefore untreatable by antibiotics. But the prescription felt decisive, and the decisive feeling was itself part of the care, because going to the doctor and coming home with nothing felt incomplete in a way that going home with a small paper bag from the pharmacy did not. The pharmacy was a short drive away, staffed by a pharmacist who knew your family by name and who filled the prescription while you waited at the counter and looked at the greeting cards and the candy by the register, which was placed there with an understanding of human psychology that required no formal study to implement. Children's medicine in the 1970s came in a small number of flavours, of which grape was the most ambitious and cherry was the most prevalent, and the word flavour is used loosely here to describe something that was in the general neighbourhood of fruit without having made the full journey. You took it from a small plastic measuring spoon. You made a face. Your mother said it wasn't that bad. You took her word for this as a statement of aspiration rather than fact. The medicine worked or it didn't, and if it didn't, you went back and received a different medicine with a different flavour in the same general family of pharmaceutical fruit impressionism. The family doctor, as distinct from the paediatrician, once you were old enough to graduate to adult medicine, operated with a similar authority and a similar efficiency and the additional characteristic of being someone your parents knew socially. Because in the 1970s suburb, the doctor was often someone whose children went to your school, or whose family attended your church, or who you saw at the neighbourhood cookout, which created a social texture around medical care that was either reassuring or complicated depending on what you needed to discuss. You didn't change doctors, you had a doctor. The doctor was your doctor, a fixed feature of the household support infrastructure in the same way that the mechanic was your mechanic, and the dentist was your dentist. A relationship of long-standing, imperfect and specific, conducted over years without the transactional neutrality of a system where the provider changes with the insurance network and the appointment is booked through an app at 11:30 at night. The bill came later, by mail, on paper, and your mother paid it by writing a cheque. There was insurance, probably, through your father's employer, and the insurance covered some of it, and the cheque covered the rest. And the rest was not the subject of a billing dispute conducted over 3 months through an automated phone system. It was a number on a piece of paper, and then a cheque, and then it was done, and you were well, or you were not yet well but working on it. And either way the appointment had been made and attended, and the doctor had said his piece, and the cherry-flavoured medicine was in the cabinet, and the suburb's quiet faith in professional expertise had been exercised and satisfied for another season. Clothing in the 1970s suburb was making a point, and the point was, we are not our parents. The 1950s and 60s had their own claims on American fashion, but by the time the 1970s settled in, the culture had made a decisive turn toward an aesthetic that future historians would describe charitably as bold and less charitably as a group hallucination, involving geometric prints, wide lapels, and an agreement that polyester could be the fabric of the future. Your father owned at least one leisure suit. If you don't know what a leisure suit was, it was a matched jacket and trousers in a soft fabric, often polyester, in a colour that existed nowhere in nature. Burnt sienna, deep plum, a particular shade of brown that seemed designed to absorb light rather than reflect it, cut with wide lapels, worn with a shirt whose collar spread across, said lapels like a bird in flight, and constituting an ensemble that its wearer considered sharp, current, and genuinely attractive. The polyester itself deserves a moment of acknowledgement, because it was the material of the decade and it had properties that natural fabrics did not. It did not wrinkle, which was presented as an unambiguous advantage, and which was, in the narrow sense of wrinkle management, correct. It also did not breathe, which in the summer months converted the garment into a personal climate system that operated in one direction only, accumulating heat against the body, and holding it there with the loyalty of a material that had committed to a relationship and was not interested in renegotiating the terms. In winter this was tolerable. In July this was a decision you lived with because it was what you had on, and there was a party. Your mother wore wide-leg trousers with a crease pressed into them, and a blouse with a collar that was either pointed or ruffled depending on the occasion, and heels that were not stilettos but were not flats. A middle elevation that conveyed effort without distress, which was the precise register of most of her choices. She may have owned a maxi dress which was long to the ankle in a print of swirling colour, earth tones, floral, geometric, sometimes all three in a collaboration that the pattern designers of the era pursued with genuine ambition, and which she wore on summer evenings when company was coming, and the occasion called for something that was not the weekday wardrobe but was not quite formal. The maxi dress was comfortable. This was not an accident. Comfortable and presentable simultaneously, this was the aspiration that the early 1970s offered women in clothing, and that they accepted with the relief of people who had been wearing girdles. The children wore what they were put in, and what they were put in was the era's children's fashion, which shared the adult wardrobe's enthusiasm for pattern and its commitment to polyester, while adding the practical consideration that children destroy clothing at a rate that makes natural fibres a sentimental choice rather than a practical one. Your jeans were wide at the ankle in the style called bell-bottom, which flared below the knee in a silhouette that required a specific length to execute properly, and that you outgrew twice a year, and that collected moisture from the ground as you walked through wet grass in a way that soaked the hem, and worked upward over a long day into a wetness that reached your calves by afternoon. Nobody complained. It was the pants, platform shoes, elevated soles of cork or wood beneath shoes of suede or patent leather, were worn by women, by men in certain social contexts, and by teenagers with a commitment to height and a willingness to navigate stairs with elevated caution. The platform added between 1 and 4 inches depending on the ambition of the shoe in the evening, and the walking surface they provided was wide enough to be stable and narrow enough to be hazardous on uneven ground, which the 1970s suburb had in abundance. The goal was height, and the suggestion of a certain kind of confidence, the kind that announces itself through footwear, which is an ancient and consistent human impulse that expressed itself in this decade through cork and suede, and the specific sound of platform heels on a linoleum kitchen floor. Fashion in the 1970s suburb was not ironic. Nobody was wearing it as a reference. Nobody was dressing this way with the knowing distance that subsequent decades would apply to everything the 70s produced. They were wearing it because it was new, and because it was theirs, and because the wide lapel and the polyester blend and the platform heel were the present tense of the culture, and the present tense always feels, from the inside, like simply how things are. The irony came later. The photographs came out at holidays. Everyone in them looked exactly like themselves. In the 1970s suburb, owning an above-ground pool was a specific social statement, not quite the statement of the in-ground pool, which was aspirational in a different register, but a statement nonetheless. An above-ground pool appeared in your backyard as a cylinder of blue, typically constructed over a weekend by your father, and whichever neighbour had been recruited on the basis of his superior ability to follow instruction diagrams, and it sat there for the next decade as a fixture of summer life, and a source of continuous maintenance responsibility that your father had not fully modelled when he ordered it from the catalogue. The pool held approximately 10,000 gallons of water that required chemical management, weekly vacuuming via a hose contraption that your father operated with great seriousness, and a filtering system that ran continuously and whose sound became the ambient soundtrack of summer in the backyard. The chemistry of the pool was your father's domain in the same absolute way that the grill and the garage were his domain, and he managed it with the focused application of a man who has taken on a technical responsibility and intends to discharge it correctly, armed with a test kit that measured pH and chlorine levels, and whose results he consulted with the seriousness of a diagnostician. Too much chlorine and everyone came out of the pool with red eyes and a faint chemical smell that lingered through. Dinner. Too little chlorine, and the water began its slow turn toward a colour that suggested the pool had opinions about being cleaned. The correct level was a narrow target that required consistent attention, and that was achieved perhaps 60% of the time, which was, given the variables, a reasonable performance. the pool arrived as a democratizing force in the neighborhood. Before the pool, summer water entertainment was the sprinkler, or the garden hose, or, if you were lucky, a family trip to a public pool where the locker room smelled of chlorine and wet concrete, and the rules were posted on a sign in language that addressed every foreseeable form of behaviour except the ones that actually occurred. With the pool in the backyard, you could swim at any time. This was the promise. The reality was that you could swim when the pool was clean, when an adult was available to supervise, and when it was warm enough to make the initial entry, which required a commitment that your body resisted every time regardless of how many times you'd done it before, worth the thermal shock of the first 30 seconds. The pool attracted the neighbourhood's children with the reliable magnetism of any body of water, and managing this attraction was a social negotiation your mother conducted on an ongoing basis. Some children were always welcome. Some children were welcome sometimes. Some children's parents had not been informed of the pool rules, and their children arrived without those parents' knowledge and needed to be supervised with extra attention, which your mother provided while also doing approximately 6 other things, and making it look like she was simply sitting in a lawn chair. The pool had rules, no running, no diving, no dunking, that were stated at the beginning of the summer with authority and enforced with the diminishing rigour that all residential pool rules experience across a long July. Getting out of the pool was not glamorous. The above-ground pool required a ladder, a small metal structure with 2 or 3 rungs that hooked over the pool's rim, and that was either stable or not quite stable, depending on how recently your father had checked the connections. You climbed down the outside of it onto the grass, wet, and the grass stuck to your feet with the adhesion of wet grass on wet skin, and you walked across the yard leaving a trail of footprints that dried in the sun before you reached the house. There was a towel, usually, on the lawn chair. It was a beach towel in a pattern that was either stripes or something printed in the colours of a sunset, and it had been washed so many times it had achieved a softness that new towels never quite have, a softness that comes from long use and long sun drying on a clothesline in a backyard in a suburb in the 70s, and it was warm from the sun, and you wrapped it around yourself and it was summer, and that was entirely enough. Music in the 1970s suburb arrived through several channels, all of them physical, all of them requiring a degree of commitment that streaming has made it easy to forget. There was the record player in the living room, a turntable component of a stereo system that sat in a wooden console and which your father operated with the reverence of a craftsman and the protectiveness of a man who had once seen a child touch a needle with their finger and had not fully recovered. There were albums, actual albums, 12-inch discs and cardboard sleeves, each one representing a decision, a purchase, a deliberate choice, stacked in a wooden crate or lined up on a shelf with their spines facing out like a library of the family's musical identity. And then, in the car, there was the 8-track player, which was a specific technology of the era, a cartridge of magnetic tape that clicked into the dashboard player and played continuously in an automatic loop, which was an excellent feature except when it caused the machine to click to the next track in the middle of a song, which it did, always, at the worst possible moment. The record was handled carefully, or it was supposed to be. Fingerprints on the playing surface caused pops and crackles, which your father considered a serious acoustic event and which you considered a background feature of music, because every record in the house had some degree of surface noise accumulated from years of play and the occasional handling incident that went undiscussed. The needle was a consumable that needed periodic replacement, and replacing the needle was a deliberate act performed with small tools and a specific focused attention, like calibrating an instrument. The result of a new needle was a noticeably cleaner sound for a few weeks before the accumulated small abrasions of regular use returned it to its characteristic warmth, which is what your father called the pops and crackles when he was in a generous mood. What was playing in your house depended on your house, in the living, Room. It might have been something your parents had discovered together, a singer-songwriter in the style of the early decade, or a band whose albums had been purchased one by one over several years and whose spines formed a continuous section of the shelf. Your mother had her preferences and your father had his, and they overlapped imperfectly in the way that people who have chosen each other's company overlap, with enough shared territory to share a living room, and enough separate territory to have a stack that was clearly hers and a stack that was clearly his. The children's musical taste was forming in real time, fed by the radio, by the television, by the records borrowed from older siblings of friends and played in bedrooms on small portable turntables that reproduced music with the fidelity of a phone call in a strong wind, and that were completely adequate for the purpose. The radio in the kitchen was tuned to a station that your mother had selected years ago and that played a particular format, a mix of current pop and familiar older material, interrupted by disc jockeys whose manner was warm and conversational, and who delivered local news and weather in the intervals between songs with the casual authority of people who had been doing this specific thing in this specific place for a long time. The radio ran most of the day as background, not listened to actively but present, providing the house with a soundtrack of its era, songs that entered the memory the way ambient sounds enter memory, through repetition rather than intention, until they became inseparable from the time and the place, and the kitchen, and the particular light of a Tuesday afternoon. The 8-track in the car was its own culture. You had a small collection of cartridges in the glove compartment or in a vinyl case on the back seat, and selecting one was one of the few acts of influence available to the passenger over the car's atmosphere. The cartridge snapped in with a satisfying click. The music began, and then, at its chosen moment, the program switch clicked, and you were briefly in the gap between tracks, a second of silence, or a faint tone, before the music resumed, possibly in the middle of the word you'd been singing along to. This happened every time. You adjusted your singing to accommodate it the way you adjusted to every other imperfection of the era's technology, not by fixing it, but by incorporating it, until it became not a flaw, but a feature, one of the sounds of being exactly where you were. Every suburban neighbourhood in the 1970s had its characters, and the particular density of a cul-de-sac or a short residential street meant that you knew these characters whether you wanted to or not. There was the neighbour whose lawn was a project, a sustained, serious, weekly investment of time and machinery, and bags of product from the garden centre. A lawn maintained at a heightened consistency that functioned as a standing comment on the lawns of everyone around it without a single word being said. There was the neighbour who had the nicest car. There was the neighbour whose Christmas lights were still up in February, which your father mentioned every time he passed the house, for reasons you did not fully understand as a child. There was the family that had moved in recently, and who had not yet been fully decoded, their patterns of behaviour, their schedule, their social affiliations, their general alignment with the neighbourhood's informal norms, all still subject of active inquiry at dinner tables on both sides of them. The competitive landscaper was a neighbourhood institution whose motivations were never fully transparent. He was out on Saturday mornings before most people had finished their first cup of coffee, running an edger along his driveway with the precision of a person who understood that the edge between the concrete and the lawn was a moral boundary as much as a physical one. His lawn was a specific shade of green that suggested either a superior product, a superior technique, or simply more time spent on the project than anyone else on the block had elected to invest. He was not aggressive about it. He did not comment on other people's lawns. He simply maintained his own to a standard that made your father, returning to the house after retrieving the morning paper, occasionally look back at his own lawn with a briefly evaluative expression before going inside. The woman who watched from the window, and every block had one, stationed at a front window with the patient observational energy of someone who had decided that the street was her primary source of information about the world, and intended to stay current, was a figure who was spoken of with mild exasperation by the adults and with the complete seriousness of a genuine authority by the children. She knew things. She had seen things. She reported things to people who had not seen them in a spirit that was either community service or something more complex, depending on whether you were the subject of the report. She was not, it should be noted, wrong about what she observed. Her information was accurate. It was the distribution of the information that required the exasperation. There was the neighbour whose husband travelled for work and who therefore ran her household alone most of the week, with a quiet capability that was observed by the neighbourhood, with a kind of peripheral admiration that was rarely stated directly. She mowed her own lawn, she put out her own trash cans, she drove the children everywhere, and was at school events and managed all of it, with an efficiency that was so consistent it became invisible, which is what happens to things that work well and happen regularly. She and your mother were friends in the way that neighbours become friends, through proximity and repetition, and the accumulated trust of many small exchanges over years. A friendship whose foundation was practical and whose texture, over time, became something more than that. The mysterious family at the end of the block had been there for 3 years, and were still, in some fundamental way, unknown. They were pleasant at the block party. They waved from the driveway. Their children played with the other children without incident. But they had not been inside anyone's house, and no one had been inside theirs. And in a neighbourhood where interiors were known, where you could describe the layout of 4 or 5 houses from personal experience, this unknownness had a faint quality of intrigue. Not suspicion exactly, just the particular curiosity of a community that understood knowing your neighbours as a form of security, and that found the gap where knowledge should be slightly unsettling, in the way that a word you can almost remember is unsettling. They would eventually, one ordinary Saturday, simply be gone, moved away, a truck in the driveway on a Tuesday, boxes and then new people, and the process of knowing would begin again from the beginning. In the 1970s suburb, the evening news was not optional background content. It was an appointment. Your father watched it the way he watched the weather and checked the mail, with the understanding that this was information relevant to his life, arriving on schedule, delivered by a person whose authority was not really questioned. The anchor sat behind a desk. The graphics were simple, the footage was often grainy, and the news itself, particularly in the early part of the decade, was heavy in ways that the living room of the suburb was not designed to absorb. Vietnam still winding down, Watergate unfolding in real time, oil embargoes, inflation, a general low-frequency anxiety about whether the American promise was cashing the checks that previous decades had written. Your father watched with the sound of dinner still happening in the kitchen. Your mother sometimes watched from the doorway drying a dish. Walter Cronkite was not merely an anchor. He was a condition of the era, a voice and a face that appeared at 6:30 or 7 o'clock with a reliability that was itself a form of reassurance. The reassurance that even when the news was bad, someone was there to tell you about it in complete sentences, with evidence, at a measured pace that implied the world was still, however barely coherent. When he said that is the way it is, it was less a sign-off than an assertion, not that everything was fine, but that whatever had happened today had been gathered, organised, and presented to you in good faith. The authority of that assertion was real in the 1970s suburb, in a way that subsequent decades of media proliferation would slowly and then rapidly erode. The Watergate hearings ran on the television in the daytime, and your mother watched them in the kitchen, with the volume turned up while she worked, not because she was a political obsessive, but because this was the thing happening and ignoring it felt like a choice she had not decided to make. The hearings had a specific quality. The long procedural stretches, the careful language of witnesses navigating between candour and consequence, the gradual accumulation of something that was either a constitutional crisis or a political dispute depending on who was explaining it to you and in which direction their sympathies ran. Your parents had an opinion. The opinion was not always the same opinion. The opinion was discussed at dinner in the way that the era's serious subjects were discussed at dinner, with care, with the awareness that the children were listening, with the implicit acknowledgement that what was happening was significant, even when its full significance was not yet legible. The gas lines of 1973 arrived in the news and then arrived in daily life with a speed that made the abstract concrete overnight. Your father lined up for gas. The line was long. The station might run out before he reached the pump, which was a possibility he managed by leaving early and monitoring the situation with the anxious attention of someone whose primary transportation had become a rationed resource. The speed limit dropped to 55 miles per hour as a conservation measure and was observed with varying degrees of conviction on the highways, where the new limit was enforced by radar guns operated by state troopers with their own opinions about the federal mandate. The thermostat in the house was turned down by 2 degrees, which was presented as a patriotic act and which produced a winter that was slightly colder than the previous one, and about which nobody said anything because saying something would have implied that the 2 degrees mattered, and your father had decided that the 2 degrees did not matter. The news ended and was followed by whatever the network had scheduled for the evening, which was a transition your father accepted without ceremony. The click of the dial or the passage from one programme to the next without his intervention, the world's large affairs replaced by the evening's entertainment, with a speed that was either unseemly or healthy, depending on whether you thought the evening news required a period of reflection before the television continued. He did not typically think it required reflection. He had received the information. Tomorrow, there would be more information. Tonight there was the rest of the evening, and the evening had its own schedule, and the schedule continued. The 1970s suburb had an organised social life that functioned in retrospect as a kind of connective tissue holding the whole thing together, a network of church, club, and community event that gave the neighbourhood its rhythm beyond the daily schedule of work, school, and television. Sunday morning had a particular quality in a suburb where church attendance was standard practice. Cars in driveways, families in clothes that were slightly better than their regular clothes, the sound of church bells that in the suburbs came not from ancient stone towers, but from modest brick buildings with signs out front whose changeable letter marquees offered weekly messages of varying degrees of inspiration. Your family went, or your family didn't go, and either way you were aware of the social coordinates of that choice in a way that modern life in a more anonymous city might not have imposed. Church in the 1970s suburb was not purely a matter of theology, though theology was present and seriously observed by those for whom it was the primary motivation. It was also an organising structure for the week, a reliable meeting point for families whose lives overlapped in the school and the neighbourhood and the grocery store, and who found in the Sunday service a formal occasion for that overlapping, a place where you saw the same people in a context that was different from the school pickup and the block party, and that carried a different weight, a different register of shared acknowledgement. The coffee hour after the service was the week's most reliable social mixing event, conducted in a church basement or parish hall with institutional coffee in a large urn and cookies on a folding table, and conversations that range from the genuinely significant to the cheerfully mundane with the ease of people who'd been sharing this specific space for years. Your father may have belonged to the Rotary Club, or the Lions, or the Kiwanis, or some configuration of the civic organisations that populated the 1970s suburb, with meetings on Tuesday evenings in the back room of a restaurant or a church hall. These organisations had purposes that were both stated and unstated. The stated purpose was community service, and the unstated purpose was an infrastructure for the social and professional lives of the men who attended, a place where relationships were maintained and information exchanged, and the fabric of the community's self-organisation was quietly reinforced by people who showed up every week, because showing up was what you did. Your mother had her own version of this, a garden club, a church auxiliary, a volunteer organisation at the school or the library, conducted on a different schedule with a different membership and a different set of conversations that were, in their structure and their social function, essentially the same thing. The Little League season organised the spring and summer around games on weekday evenings and Saturday mornings, and the parents who attended created, in the bleachers and along the chain-link fence, a weekly gathering that was nominally about the children's baseball game, and was also about everything else, the neighbourhood news, the shared reference points of families whose children occupied the same age cohort, the mild competitive investment in the game that was managed in most cases with the reasonable perspective of adults who remembered that this was youth, sports, and that perspective was later occasionally abandoned in ways that the umpire noted and did not enjoy. You played, or you watched, or both, and either way the field on a Tuesday evening in June with the light going golden over the outfield and the smell of cut grass and concession stand popcorn was the suburb at its most specifically itself, a place that worked, imperfectly, because the people in it kept showing up. The library was open on Saturday afternoons and the children's librarian knew you by name, which was partly because she was good at her job and partly because the library served a small enough community that knowing people by name was simply what happened over time. You could check out 5 books on a card that had your name on it, and the books were due in 2 weeks, and the fine for overdue books was 5 cents a day, which was a sum small enough to be affordable and large enough to produce a mild guilt that motivated return before the fine accumulated past the point of easy resolution. The library was quiet and smelled of paper and the particular cool of a building that was air-conditioned in an era when air conditioning was not yet standard, and therefore felt, on entering from the summer street, like a distinct physical reward for the effort of arriving. By the time the evening wound down in the 1970s suburban house, there was a particular quality to the darkness and the quiet that is hard to describe, except to say that it was specific to the era and the place. The television clicked off. The lights went out one by one. The house settled into its sounds, the furnace cycling, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the particular creak of a specific floorboard that every person in the family knew to avoid on the way to the bathroom at 2 a.m. The shag carpet, which had held up heroically through another full day of family life, absorbed the last footsteps of the evening. The curtains were drawn against the street light. Outside, the neighbourhood was quiet, the way a neighbourhood is quiet when everyone in it is, more or less, on the same schedule, rising and resting with the same rhythms, living near enough to each other to borrow a cup of sugar, and far enough to have an argument and still share a fence line without it becoming a tragedy. Your parents moved through the end of the evening in a sequence so practiced it had become automatic. Your mother checked the locks, front door, back door, garage door. If there was a garage door that locked, not because the suburb was dangerous, but because checking the locks was the closing gesture of the day, the physical equivalent of the final line on a list. She turned off the kitchen light last, which left the house in the specific dark of a home whose only light was the nightlight in the hallway, a small plug-in fixture that cast just enough glow to navigate without waking anyone fully, a concession to the children's night navigation and possibly also to the adults who'd been navigating this hallway in the dark for years and had developed an accurate mental map of it while still appreciating the nightlight's quiet service. Your father fell asleep in the chair sometimes, and was woken by your mother at a time that suggested this happened often enough to have developed protocol, a hand on his shoulder, his name, the low-volume instruction that it was time to come to bed. He came to bed. The chair was left in its slightly reclined position, the small table beside it holding the empty glass and the folded newspaper, and the living room arranged itself in the particular patience of a room whose work for the day was done and which was waiting, without urgency, for tomorrow. The children were in bed, not necessarily asleep. Sleep arrived on its own schedule and was not reliably on time, but in bed, in the specific darkness of their rooms, with the door cracked the exact amount that had been negotiated, the nightlight, or the hall, light providing the agreed-upon level of illumination, the window open the agreed-upon amount. You lay in the shag carpet's gravity and listened to the house. The furnace was the house's voice at night, a low ignition, a hum, a warmth that arrived at the vent in the floor with the steady reliability of something that had been doing this job for years and intended to continue. The refrigerator was the kitchen talking to itself. The floorboard in the hall was the house settling, which is what old houses do and which children, hearing it for the first time, require reassurance about and which, once reassured, find oddly comforting. The house breathing. The suburb outside the window was dark and specific. The streetlights stood at their intervals, casting orange cones of light on the pavement and the lawns and the parked cars in driveways. A dog somewhere registered something and then returned to silence. The occasional car moved through, its headlights tracking briefly across the ceiling of your room as it turned the corner, gone before the light fully registered. The neighbourhood was accounted for. Everyone was where they were supposed to be. The day, with all of its particular 1970s texture, the harvest gold, the station wagon, the 3 channels, the casserole, the lawn and the grill and the telephone on the wall, had been lived from one end to the other. This was the suburb at its most honest. Not a place of glamour or drama, not a symbol of anything except the life being lived inside it, which was ordinary and specific and held together by the unremarkable daily work of people showing up for each other in the ways that were available to them. The shag carpet, the owl lamp, the medicine cabinet with its archaeology of the family's health, all of it quiet now, waiting for morning, which would come on schedule, with the alarm clock's bells and the coffee percolating and the bathroom occupied and the day beginning again exactly as it had the day before, not because the day before was perfect, because it was theirs. And that, in the 1970s suburb, in the dark and the quiet and the furnace's patient warmth, was enough. It was more than enough. It was home. And so here you are. You've made it through a full day in the 1970s American suburb. You woke up to bells on a nightstand clock. You waited for the bathroom. You drank Tang without protest. You rode in the back of a station wagon with fake wood panelling to somewhere that took longer to get to than anyone had estimated. You ate a casserole whose primary ingredient was a can of something. You watched 3 channels on a television that required physical negotiation, argued over the telephone cord, ran through the sprinkler until the streetlights came on, and fell asleep in a room that smelled of shag carpet and crayons, and the particular warmth of a house that was heated by a furnace that had never once been thanked for its service. It wasn't glamorous. Let's be honest about that. The polyester itched. The jello mould raised questions that were never adequately answered. The car had no air conditioning in August, and your father's position on stopping was firm, and the rest stop vending machine never had exactly what you wanted. The bathroom situation was genuinely a problem that a second bathroom would have solved entirely, and that nobody solved for reasons that remain, in retrospect, unclear. But here is the thing about the people who lived this life, and they were real people. Your parents, your grandparents, the families on the blocks of 1,000 identical suburbs, from New Jersey to California, from Minnesota to Texas, living in their harvest gold kitchens and their shag-carpeted bedrooms, watching Cronkite at 6:30 and mowing the lawn on Saturday and showing up to the block party with the potato salad and the folding chairs. They were building something. Not consciously, not with any grand declaration of intent, but with the daily accumulated weight of showing up and staying and doing the unremarkable work of a life conducted in proximity to other lives. They were building a world in which the neighbour knew your name, in which the library card had your name on it and the librarian knew your face, in which the floorboard in the hall had a specific creak that everyone in the family knew to step over, which is the kind of knowledge that only exists inside a home that has been lived in long enough to be truly known. They did this without the internet, without GPS, without the ability to order anything to the front door in 2 days, or find the answer to any question within 30 seconds, or call anyone anywhere at any time from a device in their pocket. They did it with a map and a phone on the wall, and a percolator and a paper grocery list and each other. They did it imperfectly, in the way that all real things are done, with friction and compromise, and the occasional argument about the thermostat and the lawn and whether the Christmas lights should have been taken down in January, which they should have been. So tonight, as you settle into your clean and comfortable bed, with your climate-controlled room and your streaming service, and your phone on the nightstand that contains more information and entertainment than an entire 1970s suburb could access in a month, maybe take just a moment for the people who lived without all of it and found, in that smaller, slower, noisier, more particular world, something worth remembering. Who sat in the backyard on summer evenings when the air cooled and talked to the neighbours over the fence, who drove 8 hours in a car with the windows down to get somewhere they could have described from memory, who fed people and fixed things and showed up quietly without applause year after year after year. They were stubborn and ordinary and sometimes wrong and often tired and completely irreplaceable. The Harvest Gold kitchen is quiet now. The owl lamp is off. The furnace is doing its patient work. The neighbourhood is dark and still, and the streetlights are keeping watch over the lawns that someone will mow on Saturday. Sleep well. It was a good day. It always was, more or less. And tomorrow the alarm will ring, and the coffee will percolate, and the bathroom will be occupied, and it will all begin again. That's just how it was, and somehow, against all odds, it was enough. Good night.